Okay, I'm going to start by just introducing Jesse and Andrew. I'll do a more formal introduction, and then I'll say something about my own encounter with them. Let's say that. But so Andrew Culp teaches media history and theory in the MA program in Aesthetics and Politics at the School of Critical Studies at Cal Arts. He's published work on media, film, politics, and philosophy, has appeared in Radical Philosophy, Parallax, Angelaki, and Boundary 2 online. He also serves on the governing board of the Cultural Studies Association and has been involved in numerous collectives committed to abolishing the state, capital, and all other forms of oppression. And together they refer to this approach as anti-politics. And he is, of course, also the author of Dark Deleuze, a book that proposes a revolutionary new image of Gilles Deleuze's thought suited to our 24/7, always on media environment, and a guerrilla guide to refusal, which is a field guide to a non-fascist life at the end of the world as we know it. And then Jesse Cohn is an American literary and cultural scholar and translator, and has translated works by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Gustav Landauer, and Daniel Coulson. The latter, of course, being the wonderful little treasure of a book, a little philosophical lexicon of anarchism from Proudhon to Deleuze. He's also the author of Anarchism and the Crisis of Representation, Hermeneutics, Aesthetics, Politics, and also Underground Passages, which I recently actually got a real copy of in South Africa. And yeah, the amount of research in that book really astounded me. I think it's very impressive. But also importantly, Jesse is also one of the founding members of the North American Anarchist Studies Network. And so I've known Jesse for a couple of years. He's, I think we met first when you contributed to anarchism, to Deleuze and Anarchism. That's right. And he's been a big inspiration for me in terms of my own anarchist development. I've read a lot of his work. I think he's one of the most prolific writers. I think of him as someone who knows everything. And of course, Andrew Culp, I only more recently met sort of online and sort of via my own book. But of course, I read his work when Dark Deleuze came out. I think it's a, it's a book that really challenged a lot of kind of Deleuzean concepts that had become stale. And I think that's what you were trying to do, Andrew, is to really reinvigorate these terms that we use, and how, and to provoke a kind of new way for us to think about it in terms of politics. And so that's, I think that's what brings us together also, is that we're all three scholars interested in Deleuze and Guattari, at least in some way. Anarchists, I think politics is very close to our hearts. And so, of course, we're here because I wanted to do something for the launch of my own book, which is Anarchism After Deleuze and Guattari, Fabulating Futures. And I couldn't think of two better people to kind of have a conversation with about the book, because I think, it's not only my thought that's in here, it's like their thought is also in here. It's influenced me, and I think it's part of this kind of, I think we're all hoping to kind of deal with some of the problems we see in our culture today, and maybe have a discussion about that. Yeah. Maybe I can give the floor to one of you two.
Andrew, you want to lead off?
Excellent. In classic anarchist fashion, we're sort of like passing it on to the next person to see who sort of takes the bait. So I'll start. You know, Chantelle's book was an incredible pleasure to read because there's been this sort of ongoing, almost sort of missed encounter or misencounter between DNG and anarchism. In their own writing, they're a bit critical of anarchism, even though it seems like by the time the 1990s roll around, they have perhaps just as much or more proximity to developing anti-authoritarian currents through the anti and alter globalization movement as they do to the forms of Marxism as it sort of became stale and had to reimagine itself through the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so, Chantelle, in your book, you do such an excellent job sort of pulling through these main currents to, you know, ask, like your title says, anarchism after DNG. And what I found so remarkable is that each chapter is an encounter not just between DNG and anarchism, but often other material that pushes, provokes, allows us to ask not just what one field contributes to the other, like just some basic transportation, but that all elements in the encounter can't be the same by the end. And, you know, there are a lot of big themes, so maybe we can just sort of tackle particular ones that I found quite interesting. I mean, for me, I think that one of the most important elements to push it beyond, let's say, just what stale, let's say, state theory or a lot of these sort of big picture things in structuralism, towards something that's really engaged and really pressing and urgent, is the encounter you put between anarchism, the indigenous or indigeneity, and DNG. So I was wondering if you could just sort of speak a little bit more about what was so important about that encounter for you and what happened when you put the three together.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is an important. I think living in South Africa, indigeneity is important because we don't live in the global north. It's and I think that these are questions that we ask ourselves all the time, or at least try to. These are things we grapple with, especially in South Africa, coming with, you know, from apartheid, which has now obviously been disbanded for 25 years already, I think, or around there. But it's actually a very short time if one thinks historically. And so I think this is a question that keeps coming back for me, you know, in writing about Deleuze and Guattari and also anarchism. There is, in fact, this interesting indigenous strain already for, you know, even in Deleuze and Guattari, some of their concepts, like, you know, like even when we think of the war machine, come from work by Pierre Clastres, who also actually drew on, you know, his work in the Amazonian basin. And so I think there's already that sort of element there. But then also, you know, the Zapatistas, I think, have been, or is, or are a living inspiration for many anarchists. Even though they're not anarchists per se, they're definitely anarchistic. And I think, you know, when we ask these questions like, is anarchism alive? Can anarchism make a difference in our world today? I think there are these real examples that we can draw from. And so for me, that was kind of important to not just think of indigeneity as something that is from the past, but as something that is very much in our contemporary world, part of our kind of historical, legacy, and also something that can teach us about, you know, I mean, as you know, two of the big themes, I guess, in my book is long circuits and care. So this idea of how we can create social practices that that allow for a kind of connectivity between generations. And I think this is particularly what bringing Deleuze and anarchism and indigeneity together I think what it did is it took the theory into practice. That's what it did for me. So giving actual examples, living examples of how we can counter some of what we are seeing, some of the effects we're seeing that the digital world is having on our thoughts, on our social relations, you know, and yeah, you know, I think these are the most pressing questions, or some of the most pressing questions of our time. And so I would say that's really where that went for me, is this kind of living example. So yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for flagging a couple of themes, which I confess I was also thinking about in preparing for this. I'm torn between which one I want to talk about first, but long circuits and care. Well, one of the things that I found really valuable about this book was its insistence that we have to stop sort of living in the 1970s, I guess, and appreciate some real differences between what, say, Foucault was talking about back in the 70s as disciplinary societies with their model of governmentality, and this new algorithmic governmentality that's characteristic of our own control society. So that where discipline operates in a rigid way, using predetermined categories to sort people into governable groups. This idea of control is more adaptable, like an algorithm that adjusts itself to your supposed preferences. I'm thinking here of things like surge pricing, or the ever-changing mystery of ad pricing on Google and Meta, which a recent article by Chris Carlson reminded me of the other day. I've been trying to learn how to do it for one of my other enterprises, and it's just an opaque mystery. So how does this new kind of adaptable power change the picture in terms of resistance? How do you resist a system that is constantly reshaping itself to adapt to you?
Yeah. Yes, and I think also adapt to us, but also getting us to adapt to it. So this question of resistance is very interesting, right? Because I think, you know, in Deleuze's postscript on the societies of control, he talks about control, but this idea of control, this new form of power, is really related to modulation, isn't it? And he starts thinking actually about modulation, but of course he doesn't live long enough, perhaps, to really unpack this idea of modulation. And I think this is where Stigler's work has been really influential for me, and it's quite close to his idea of adaptation versus adoption. And so this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is this, you know, what happens in this kind of modulation? Well, one of the things that is happening is that these systems, these things like social media, are designed to hijack our dopamine systems, right? And so there's this almost very shallow, but an affective loop going on. And so this is very interesting for me in terms of thinking about resistance, because if we want to resist what feels pleasurable, these kinds of like dopamine hits, you know, or through these dopamine hits, then we have to find ways that can respond. We have to find something that can respond to that can be at least also pleasurable at times. And so I think resistance, you know, when maybe this is just me, but when one thinks of resistance, it often feels like this kind of heavy word, like it has to be hard all the time, or at least I think at least a lot of political theories framed that way. Whether it's true in practice, well, of course, that's a different thing, but it's at least framed that way. And so I think, yes, resistance is, of course, also hard at times and also hard work at times. But I think that if we want to entice young people to get away from this thing that is making them feel good, there's got to be something else making them feel good. And so for me, to get back to the indigeneity even here, like commoning practices, for example, that's something that we can learn from, but also practice together that can actually feel good and help us then during times that are maybe harder in resistance. And so yes, I think one of the things is, of course, becoming, first of all, aware of how much we are adapting to these computers around us, basically. How much we give into it, because we all do to some degree, maybe I'm being hyperbolic when I say all, but I feel like all of us do. Because they are enticing and they're there, your cell phone is always there. It's almost like attached to you these days. And I see it even with my students. It's hard for them to put it away just for class time. It's like they want to reach for it. And so it's a kind of an interesting, this is a difficult dilemma, because of course, this is part of what also keeps us from doing politics. It's a distraction. It's a distraction also from the ecological crisis. And so this, I think, is also important, is that we do have to, it asks us to even ask questions about what it means to face death, right? Because very much life is entangled in this question of death at the moment, which kind of haunts, especially the younger generations. And so I think that there's something really important that we need to tease out.
Yeah, perhaps you've already sort of built together this wonderful constellation that already addresses this. But one thing that I found really important was when you're talking about capitalism, you bring up, an approach to it that's based in desire, that's also connected to the question of life. I think there's certainly precedence for this, perhaps even more so in anarchist critiques of capitalism than Marxist ones, because from the anarchist side, I'm thinking of someone like Charles Fourier, who thought that feeling was an emotion and a passional politics was just as important and perhaps the motivating force behind it, perhaps in distinction or complementing this sort of more rationalist approach or the science of society that Marxism often presents itself with. And so, of course, D&G come to this through a sort of Marxo-Freud synthesis, but even that gets, like you said, dour, sad, militant. We think of Adorno, I don't think we're thinking of a joyful militancy or anything like that. So I wanted to invite you to give more opportunity to think about that precise intersection or encounter that you stage between a sort of critique of capitalism and then life and desire and passion and feeling.
Yeah, so for me, this is it's something I'm grappling with, really, because it's an ongoing question for me. I don't think I've really reached grand conclusions about it. But what I have realized is that what I do think about a lot is how the right have mobilized something around affect. And so it's been very effective in terms of getting it, and it's a libidinal charge, So here I think the question of desire in Deleuze and Guattari becomes interesting again. For quite a long while, I was interested in other things in Deleuze and Guattari because I felt that question of desire had been talked to death. And so I kind of ignored it almost. It was like there in the sort of back of my mind. But recently it's become interesting for me again, because I can see it. I see that libidinal kick that people get out of these easy responses, out of these very affective responses about, when you can just say whatever you want, be the misogynist you want to be, or, there's very much linked to these like quick and fast libidinal charges. And so I find that interesting because I think that's something that should give the left pause to think about something. That is what I think. And I think for me, so this has become really a question again. If we want to, and having said that, again, to get back to things like dopamine, which is also related to something of the affective, because it's what drives us to, it's a kind of motivating charge, really, hormonal charge and neurotransmitter. So it's very interesting to think about what is happening here. And I think it's quite complex because, of course, a lot of money gets spent on designing apps and all these like different platforms that we engage with. And, so for us to like start thinking about these things and unpacking them, we maybe don't have the time and energy and money behind us to be able to like, to do this in these very sophisticated ways. But I think that's actually what's required, is that we have to start thinking together about, what is happening to our desires and what do we desire and how do we change our desires again, especially, as my students said to me the other day, we were talking about gender and race basically, and some of them were getting excited. It was a difficult conversation, and at some point somebody said, but what does it matter? Because it's the end of the world. And then I just thought, again, it's that idea of life and death, so very much at the surface, this entanglement so very much at the surface at the moment. And this kind of desire almost to escape it, this desire to say, well, who cares? Why should I care? Why shouldn't I just scroll and feel good? Why should I do politics that's work, And so these are questions for me, because I think it must also, I think there's at least an aspect that must be like, it feels good to be a leftist. It feels good to be an anarchist. And to kind of spread that, because of course, I think critical mass is an ongoing question for anarchists. But it's an important one. I think it's an important one, something that we should grapple with. So yes, I think that's, I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but yes, it's definitely something that's, excuse me, that's an ongoing question for me.
Absolutely. And something that I'm hearing from you too is this sort of older question posed in the 70s as a matter of fascism, which of course at that time was fascism not put to rest in 1945? Has it continued into 1968 or through the Mitterrand years or something? Has now become pressing issue in a different way. It's a neo-fascism. It's some other form of fascism that is frightening, not just because of its consequences, but because of the way in which it hijacks maybe some of the things that we thought that we were good at on the left, which was, an affective politics of belonging, of a sense of purpose, of these other things that have now become a matter for deep reactionary movements. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on that, or if I should hand it back over to Jesse for another question.
I would actually, like to pose the question to you and Jesse, and hear what you think of this.
Absolutely. I think that there's a reason why Antifa, at least in the United States, became this amazing boogeyman. And it's because, in this very classic psychoanalytic sense, it is the point of anxiety. And I've been so frustrated by people who've wanted to simply reduce it to a matter of fact, to make fun of the right-wingers for being somehow like unhinged from reality or something. And I think that D&G provide the resource to say that the thing that really binds people together is not some sort of reality, but it's their shared unconscious or their fantasy or the social formation that gives meaning and significance to what they do. And so I think that Antifa in this way is incredibly charged. And there's a reason why, and I think it's because we really are in a form of fascism right now. I don't know if there's some universal formula for it, probably not. And so that means some genealogical work might be helpful. One thing is that I think one part of the template was set in Europe, even starting in the 60s, where there was not just a new left, there was also a new right that was reading many of the theorists that we read as well, and that are just as important. I mean, they're sort of Gramscians for the right, or Foucauldians for the right. All of this sort of, Deleuze himself saw this with the new philosophers and all this sort of like anti-Soviet figures. But I think we're in something else now. Some of the template was set by the new right, but I think that there are other novel and molecular forms sort of circulating right now. And I think there's an over-reliance on the historic forms of fascism, like saying that it's simply an outgrowth of Germany or an outgrowth of Italy or something. And that the thing that anarchism hopefully provides us is a new lens to be able to really confront fascism in a way that liberal democracy can't, that it's really just a hijack, that fascism hijacks liberal democracy. And so the liberal Democrats, especially the ones in the United States who hope that the center is going to hold, are just flailing. They're not going to really be able to go anywhere. But I'm sure Jesse has a much more sophisticated read on the situation than I do.
No, simpler maybe. But I like what you were saying, Andrew, about the sort of inadequate liberal response to fascism. You actually provoked me to think about it as kind of a constant will to surrender desire, right? Let's just swallow our misgivings and vote for this guy because at least he's not one of these fascists. Let's kind of restrict our imaginations to this point because we're scared. Yeah, and whereas the fascists are like, we'll give you exactly what you want, right?
Maybe this reminds me of two really important threads that come through both of your work, which is about imagination and the fact that anarchism is deeply committed to a speculative, imaginal, different future that is unlike the one we currently exist within. So an alternative to the liberal democratic sort of march forward of what we already know. So I'd love to hear the role of imagination in the way in which both of you have thought, not only D&G or these sort of third terms that sort of work within Chantelle's excellent book, but the anarchist imagination. What are the important constitutive elements you see in that, and maybe some resources or books or other things that you'd like to note for everyone here today for us to follow up on and to expand our own imaginations.
Yeah.
Do you want to start, Jesse?
Yeah. Well, actually, that kind of connects with some things I was thinking about the book as well. I really loved this one passage in the book where you were talking about you were citing Deleuze as talking about that how the trick is really to open up a new field of the possible. That actually reminded me of an old line from Emma Goldman. Goldman said that a practical scheme is one that is already in existence or a scheme that could be carried out under the existing conditions, but it is exactly the existing conditions that one objects to, and any scheme that could accept those conditions is wrong and foolish. So you need to somehow get back of those the sort of limited conditions that have structured the problem already to so that other Deleuzian formula doesn't operate as a curse, right? The idea that the problem always has the solution it deserves in terms of the way in which it is stated, right? Which might be a fancy way of saying you ask a stupid question and you get a stupid answer.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, the role of imagination, I think, is more important now than it has been in a long time. I think we desperately need new imaginings for our world, for different worldings to be possible. And for me here, you know, I think anarchist sci-fi has really been a big inspiration for me in my life, sci-fi in general, but anarchist sci-fi especially for really bringing home these very different ideas and making them possible in my own mind. And I think that's often so difficult it is sometimes difficult to imagine. You know, you mentioned fear, Jesse, and I think that's such an important aspect actually in our current societies. There is a lot of fear. You know, this idea that exactly that, like, let's just vote for this, or let's just like accept this. At least it's not that. At least this is not that. It's not as bad as there. And so it's a kind of complacency, actually. But I think it's not just because people are bad or lazy. I think it's also because people are genuinely overwhelmed in our societies. I think working hours have become longer and longer for many people. You know, life is pretty expensive at the moment. so I think, you know, fuel costs, food costs, these things are I think often more pressing. And so the imagination is something that we think of as something that comes after you have food and after you have this and after you have done your work. And so I think we actually need to take a different view on that and to see the imagination as very much part and parcel of all of these things. That we can't actually say it comes last. Well, maybe it should come first for a while. Maybe the imagination is what we need to like draw on. And for me, you know, I know that's not the culture that we live in, but for me, reading is really still finding different worlds. You know, we live in this, yeah, I know we live in this very consumerist society where people want to watch YouTube all day, and you know, and there's nothing wrong with YouTube per se. Of course, there are many good things there that one can find, but I think having conversations with people, that's also something that stimulates imagination. You know, I think Andrew, even of the kinds of collectives that you run and the kind of work you do there, I think those, even things like info shops, if we're thinking about like the anarchist milieu, things like info shops have had such a huge impact on my own life, my own imagination, finding a good or an interesting zine or just something that sparks a different way of seeing, and often just different ways of seeing snowball into kind of different ways of being and different ways of creating together. And so I think imagination for me is really closely linked to prefiguration and to utopia. And utopia is an important anarchist concept, I think. And in fact, it is also in Deleuze and Guattari's work. Maybe not at the top of their work, but it's certainly in there. And again, but not as a blueprint, it's not this idea of a blueprint. It's that, if we think about the Zapatistas, I love that asking we walk, or, this idea that as we walk, we try and unfold and create the conditions necessary for what we need to create. And so for me, that's maybe kind of linked to imagination.
I feel like we're treading really close here back to one of those themes that you signaled earlier on, and that I wanted to get to, the notion of long circuits.
Yeah.
Which really fascinated me. I'd not been familiar with Bernard Stiegler before, so you introduced me to him, and to his notion of long circuits, which I guess is a play on the idea of a short circuit, but still kind of enigmatic to me. I confess. Can you what is circulating in a Stieglerian long circuit? Can you explain the concept a little more concretely, maybe?
So Stiegler has influenced me quite a lot in the past couple of years. In some ways, I actually feel that he takes up where the postscript on the societies of control leave off. It's almost like he, at least, I mean, he's not that Deleuzian, he's more Heideggerian, I would say, but he does actually sort of riff on the same themes. And but what is interesting is, of course, if we think about what a short circuit is a disruption, to use a very Stieglerian kind of concept, but it's an interruption. It's an interruption of something. And so for Stiegler, this idea of disruption is, it's related to a number of things, but particularly to the preservation and transmission of collective memory over time. And so long circuits really are precisely that. It's like the range of practices, artifacts, rituals, and so on that we use to create connections between generations. And so to preserve a kind of collective memory and transmit a collective memory. And so, I think it's actually even Stiegler who talks about that we might have given up on religion too soon, because there's nothing that replaces it or replaces its functions, and some of the kind of cohesive functions that it has had in society. And so that's really, for me, what long circuits are about. Is it's got a kind of binding function, I would say, whether it's the binding of thought, the binding of memory, the binding of the psyche even, the binding of the drives. So there's this idea that, even there's, Stiegler even talks about the unbinding of the drives that is going on, and that I think for him, especially the question of the youth is a really important one. And how we can take care of the youth. What does that mean? And And so for him, I think this idea of long circuits, producing long circuits in society, is really important. And so, you know, to come back even to things like info shops, that's, you know, anarchist, that's something that has a long anarchist history. And so it also preserves, for example, anarchist memory, collective anarchist memory that can get passed on from generation to generation, and it keeps these ideas alive, and, you know, keeps new generations trying out these ideas and prefiguring them in different ways. And so I think for me, yeah, and of course, the question of long circuits is also very closely tied to care, how we take care not only of ourselves and each other and our environments and our societies, but also of what Stegler calls the pharmacological situation. What has happened, which for him is very much the digital transformation in society. And of course, a pharmacon is something that is both poisonous and curative at the same time. Something like antibiotics even can be a pharmacon. But for him, it's very much the digital disruption. And if we are to come out of this in a way that doesn't completely destroy us, we need to find ways to take care of what is happening and to carefully respond to it. And I think part of carefully responding to it is finding new ways, new rituals, new practices, new forms of sharing collective memory that can be transmitted over time, rather than be submitted to this instantaneousness of online life. Because I think that's, you know, that's really part of the problem. Even if you think about like how people take photos on cell phones and just never look at it again, or it's this constant, it's all about the current moment, the instant moment. And the instant moment isn't bound to any other connection of time. And so something strange is happening to our time consciousness. And so, of course, that also influences not only us individually, but how we relate to each other in societies.
You kind of reminded me of, do you know Ivona Janiska's book? She also did this very interesting kind of post-anarchist take, relying more on folks like Judith Butler and Peter Sloterdijk. But she also had this kind of theme of slowness, of slow transformations, and sort of a slow process of training that she sees as an alternative to that kind of culture of speed.
Yeah, slowness, and I think even you know, I think Andrew, even in your book, your new book, you try and give kind of concrete ways of resisting. You know, and I like this idea of fugitivity also, and maybe you can say a bit more about that, because I actually think it links to the discussion that we've just had.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. Yeah, my new book is I don't know, I work at an art school, and many of my colleagues are creative writers, so I've really taken this a lot of license to experiment with form, which is a common conversation I have with all of my colleagues here. And so there are a lot of sort of short sections, fragments, pieces that sort of come into the overall book. And some of them are very theoretically inflected. Others are glimpses or portraits into a historical moment or a particular group. It's very non-sectarian. Actually, I draw on all kinds of groups, from anarchists to punks to even sort of party Marxists or others that, you know, I don't always find a lot of common ground with. And the idea was, let's say, somewhere between Foucault and Marshall McLuhan, who famously wrote his books as what he called probes, meant to just sort of shock people into thinking differently. Or excuse me, also sort of Foucault's genealogical inquiry, which does a history of the present by never really talking about the present. And something that I didn't have an opportunity to write about because I've only recently gotten involved, but I think is a perfect example of how this question of care is so timely and so important right now. I recently moved to downtown Los Angeles from having lived sort of on the outskirts. And it puts me in about 2-block proximity to Skid Row, perhaps the most notorious neighborhood of all of Los Angeles, where there are people who live on nearly every inch of the sidewalk, but then also in series of temporary housing that is throughout that area. And during the pandemic, when the George Floyd uprising began, a number of union members, stage workers in particular, so people who work in the entertainment industry doing everything from production to carrying cameras, started providing food and water for people showing up at demos because they understood that their own particular expertise was logistics and moving things. And it was something that they could organize quite well. And it became so successful that they created a Skid Row action committee around housing. And that one version of it is a mutual aid program in which 3 or 4 days a week, they, or I could now say I, because I participate in it a bit, give out more than $1,000 worth of supplies. And on the one hand, this may look like just all the other charity or community giveaway programs that exist in Skid Row. But what's remarkable, and I don't know why I had such prejudice or I couldn't see this, the first thing that really shocked me when I arrived was that half of the people involved in the actual distribution are just members of Skid Row. People who live in or near the community and have a deep social network. It's a place because everyone lives their lives on the street. They can't help but be very social. But it's also self-organized because city services are so slow and delayed and inadequate that people find other ways to work together, sometimes in a very deeply private or personal way, but usually in some sort of shared or collective way, a form of self-organization that I think anarchists may only do on the weekend. And for folks here, it's every day. It's a matter of survival. But it's also done joyously. Everyone has their own approach to it. It's very transversal and polyvocal. And on some ways, it's relationship building or capacity building or organizational, some of these other issues. But really, when it comes down to it, it's a social practice. It's mutual aid, and it's learning new ways of caring for each other when all the other infrastructure of care has broken down. And I think that that's the beginning of a different approach that I knew had to happen because of the pandemic, because all of these fault lines opened up and people were left in the lurch and they didn't know what they were doing. But I think it's also an image of how people will continue working together in the future. And then I think that that's what's so important about the conversations across all of our work is knowing that we're in a moment where perhaps one of the biggest issues is care, and everyone knows it, but also, at least in the United States, one of the responses is, well, let's do pressure politics for the federal government to fix our broken healthcare system. And that's so disenabling because it's just asking someone else to fix the problem for us. So I think that the more I meet people in direct service and in aid work, that they tend to be anarchists, and they've just lodged themselves within a certain institutional context, or at least the most effective people are the people who stick around for a while, are anarchists. And I think that that's something that we should continue exploring because it's, at least in our economy, I see it moving towards two things: more care, I guess more service, but also security, military, securitized services. And so, the only one that has any tinge of hope will be the care side.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's such, those are such practical examples of caring. You know, for me, I think caring has actually, or care, has become like a really important philosophical concept, but also an important political concept that I think has almost been underexplored in some. It's obviously been part of anarchist practice and theory for so long, but maybe not explicitly so, but it's, you know, it's woven into it. But I think, you know, through things like mutual aid, solidarity, those are practices of care. And so I think, I do think that we have to find these ways of caring in smaller communities, so that we get to know our communities, you know, get to reach out to each other, help each other, because I think a lot of the world, you know, these imbalances that we have, helping each other, caring for each other, also makes different things possible for different people at different times. You know, it's a kind of capacitation. It's not a handout. It's something very different. Care is something very different. And it's also not a band-aid. I think that's really important, because I do think, you know, I think as we have seen, capitalism just keeps getting madder. It's quite insane at the moment. I don't even know what, you know, we can call it surveillance capitalism or whatever, any of these new terms going around. And I think we do need new terms, because it's certainly not what we were looking at in the 80s or 90s. So I do think we need these new terms. But I also think that, yeah, as things get harder, we need to find new forms of care, and in fact put a lot of emphasis on it. And, you know, it makes me think of that. I actually used the quote in my book, but it makes me think of that. It's by Bifo Berardi, where he talks about acting as if. Actually, I wouldn't mind reading it if you just give me a moment.
Maybe while you search for it, I'll note that as you were talking, I kept thinking of this Crime Think poster that came out 15 years ago about defining various political approaches through how people do the dishes.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe I'll just link it in the chat in case anyone wants to.
That's good.
Perfect.
So he says, my knowledge and understanding miss the event, the singularity. So I must act as if the forces of labor and knowledge might overcome the forces of greed and of proprietary obsession, as if the cognitive workers might overcome the fractalization of their life and intelligence and give birth to the self-organization of collective knowledge. I must resist simply because I cannot know what will happen after the future, and I must preserve the consciousness and sensibility of social solidarity, those long circuits, of human empathy, of gratuitous activity, of freedom, equality, and fraternity, just in case, right? And I love that. It's almost like caring for me is also this gratuitous activity. It's something that can't actually be controlled by capital. It can kind of get through the cracks. And so I think it's this idea, this idea of like gratuitousness has actually stuck with me. You know, what does it mean as an anarchist, as even an anarchist thinking with Deleuze and Guattari? What do these gratuitous activities look like? And I think that there's a lot that we can take from Deleuze from that, you know, ideas like the fold and you know even kind of becoming all of these, we can reinvigorate these terms that have become so overused. I think when we start thinking of them in terms of care and these kind of gratuitous practices. What do you think, Jesse?
I think that's exactly what it's all about. And to bring it back to the conversation about fascism, I think fascism has always been kind of a permission not to care, right? The Italian fascist slogan was "No me frego," right? It doesn't bother me. I don't. Am I bothered, right? Yeah. So yeah. Real anti-fascism then might be care work, both the affect and the practice.
Absolutely.
And maybe outside this restricted economy framework in which the socialist subject is often constructed, where politics only happens in the nexus of mutual benefit, and instead seeing the excessive gratuitous as the gift or as something that you pass along, but then other people will as well. And I think that opens up a different framework for care. It's not just that we only care about those people that we can, extract some sort of advantage from.
Yeah, the gratuitousness, that's right there in Kropotkin, actually. When he's describing mutual aid, he describes it in terms of this kind of gratuitousness, and he actually refers to a sort of Nietzschean thinker of his time, I think it's Jean-Marie Guillot, right, as talking about this kind of, almost sort of like loosed from the logic of self-preservation, even, if you and including up to the idea of self-sacrifice. There's this gratuitousness.
Yeah.
So I've noticed that there's like a really excellent number of participants who've joined us, and we've been chatting for an hour. I don't want to step in to shape the conversation in some undue way, but might this be an opportunity to invite some people who are here and participating to join the conversation as well?
Absolutely. Does anyone have questions? Would anyone like to ask a question? Make a comment, add a thought? Okay, I see one. Do you think that the feminist care literature is helpful here?
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. I think the kind of ethic of care that feminists have talked about and practiced for a very long time, I think has informed many of our conversations and thoughts over the years. I think it's actually had an influence on anarchist thought too, just as, there are these kind of overlapping ideas and that we get from each other.
Yeah, there's this really excellent WordPress blog that collated a lot of the care labor literature up until about 2012 or so. I'm dropping a link in the chat right now. It's just caringlabor.wordpress.com. And of course, a lot of it comes out of a socialist feminist trajectory in the 80s. One of my favorite projects was actually inspired by equal parts the situationist derive as a sort of ethnographic field method, but also sort of post-autonomous, post-Italian forms of precarious labor. And it was done in Spain. They called themselves Precarious a la Deriva. And they showed up to a big labor march. And they're like, where are the women? Where's the care labor? And they're like, it's not here. And so that was the instigation to say, we need to find it elsewhere. And they came up with a number of conclusions. Like one was, people who do care work maybe don't have the capacity to strike in the same way, because if they were to leave or to suspend their care work for any large period of time, it's not like the widgets would just sit on the assembly line for a while and you can return by flipping the switch and make the line move once again. It's people's lives are at stake, and there would be incredible problems and pain and suffering if they didn't do it. And so that's why they adopted the derive, because they then wanted to find the cracks and fissures and unexpected places within the city where care work or service work or emotional labor was happening. And so I wonder, that was prior to even Web 2.0, maybe what Stiegler or you, Chantelle, would say about how we would find care work today. What are the circuits we'd engage in? What are new methods we would have to invent to sort of find it in the way that our economy and our state space has been restructured since then?
Yeah, it's actually making me think of Marieres Libres now, but this idea of empowering each other by helping each other learn, by sharing care, and I think for example in our society we still deal with a large portion of South Africa is still illiterate, for example. That for me is something that is so closely linked to care, right? Or and the kind of care work also that that I think goes in between sort of like nannies looking after children. I think we have to think even around what is possible for people. How can we restructure our lives in such ways that we can practically help each other to participate in meaningful practices, whatever that looks like? And so, I think some of these things that you're talking about, like care labor, of course, it does often become women's labor still in most parts of the world, I think. And so I think part of that is also rethinking how we can share those care labors, what it means, and how that would also shape masculinities differently, for example, because I think even care can sometimes, I think, be a feminized word, or this kind of feminized concept. And in fact, it is not. It should be, we should actually take it away from that and kind of make it gender non-conforming in a way. So I think that there are these very practical things we have to think about, like, and also, for example, what it takes for either women or men, but what it takes for them to be able to participate in something that they really care about, outside of work, looking after families, might be something simple as like, somebody wanting to participate in a communal gardening project, but not being able to because they're either working or looking after children, or, looking after parents. Looking after parents is also, I think, becoming a thing again, right? It's not like our parents have these, are looked after by the state. No, in fact, they don't have pensions often, and it takes a lot of care work, and even that care work becomes women's care work. So I think that these are different. It's almost like we have to start we have to start reimagining our societies. And I think it starts with our close communities, our friends even, like even how can you help your friends in different ways that make life or a different kind of life possible for them again.
This reminds me of the discourse around Jenny Livingston's very famous documentary, Paris is Burning, which was, of course, this documentary about young, usually poor, often homeless because they were kicked out of their homes, what we'd now call like trans and queer people of color ball culture in New York, where there are a series of categories where people then do a drag performance. And when people were trying to make sense of Judith Butler's early work, they said, oh, is it really about drag? Should everyone just be sort of getting on the stage like Paris is Burning? But what's remarkable about Butler's reading of Paris is Burning, I mean, some people have some complaints about it, and there are very important critiques of the film, like bell hooks. But what Butler writes is the most important part of this film for her was not the performances on the stage. It was actually this much less discussed element of the new forms of social relation that these homeless and dispossessed youth had around constructing their own mode of kinship, houses, in which there were house mothers, people were children of the house, and that it was an alternative to the bio family, and even a sort of straight or normcore sort of family. And I just love the inspiration that you're suggesting here, Chantelle, that it sort of happens at the sort of deep, what Levi-Strauss might even call like a symbolic level of society, and that anarchism really pays attention to this in a way that other approaches don't. Yeah, and so care is both very personal and molecular, but it also sort of aggregates to a deep level as well.
Yeah, I think that idea of aggregation is really important, right? It's the flows coming together, and I think that's even important in terms of resistance. When we think of resistance and even care as resistance, that there's this cumulative stream or that takes place, and I think that's the molecular, right? That's the stuff we don't see. It sometimes looks like nothing is happening, but in fact, when we proliferate these practices of care, when we proliferate these different forms of resistances, when we proliferate these different ways of producing long circuits, at some point, something different it allows for a different threshold to be crossed. And I think that's the stuff that you can't see, but that we work at, right? It's the working at, the continual prefiguration of what we want to see in our future.
Yeah, maybe it's an alternative image of revolution, whereas the Leninist Marxist still imagines politics to be a game of chess in which when you capture the king, you've won the war and you're able to, take over the state and run it however you please. I think what you're suggesting appears much more like an aesthetic revolution, where we know that there are these sort of society-wide transformations that happen in terms of taste or preference or what's given and the possible, but that very rarely is there just such a structured, segmented, or striated system where you just replace a few elements through some mass procedure, molar procedure, and suddenly everyone falls in line.
Any other questions? I see there's a comment.
I can read it. Yeah, so Aragorn writes, more a comment than a question, but in terms of desire and the building of long circuits, parenthetically, those that include care that flows through and helps maintain these circuits, I've always been struck by the Brazilian anarchist practice of somaterapia. Somaterapia, thank you. It's in somatic therapy, I imagine.
Yeah.
How it combines radically effective practices of bodywork, group psycho and schizoanalysis, capoeira, and a political milieu building, and radical analysis. It also reminds me a lot of Guattari's distinction between the low and diverted levels of desire, characterize what he calls subjugated groups, those sad militants of dramatic leftist sects, and also the liberation of flows of desire in group subjects, the imaginers, the long circuit designers, and others.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you want to say more about Somatherapia, Aragon. It's a very interesting history, but he knows it far better than I do. Okay, well, there we go. There's a little link. Oh, I remember now. I think he's on a desktop, so yes. But yeah, I think it's worth reading that. It's those are interesting practices, and again, different practices I think we can learn from. You know, they do these kind of experimental. It is very Guattarian in this, like, you know, him trying out different practices in these groups that he was always assembling at the board, and so some of them are quite out there. Some of these practices are quite out there, like trusting the group to kind of hold you as you're leaning over a cliff. It's maybe a little bit out there for me. I don't know if I want to trust anyone that much, but I think it's really interesting. You know, what they do is build practices of trust, really. I think that's another thing, you know, thinking of care, is I think a lot of trust has been broken in society. I think I think we all feel this. We feel so let down by governments, by NGOs, by economic system, by work, by all of these forces that kind of drain our lives from us in many ways. And I think actually trust, and I think anarchists are actually good at building trust. I think this is something that they are really good at, and that, you know, that makes me actually proud to be an anarchist, is that there are these practices of care and trust. John.
Thank you so much, Chantal. I thought I will show my face if I'm going to say something. Thank you so much to you and the others for this conversation. Trust is a way into what I wanted to ask you what to say some more about, because I think you're entirely right about that, and trust goes very much hand in hand with care, and building, and any of the kinds of building you were describing. But not to take us back from all the positive work, but earlier you highlighted two things that we are up against amongst others. I mean, one is algorithms, and algorithms as part of society of control. And the other is, well, I don't know exactly how to encapsulate what you were saying, but something to do with the ways in which, something about a difference between right and left, to do with people on the right feeling more satisfied or fulfilled in some sort of respect, or finding more that does that, and the left feeling the opposite. And firstly, that seems, amongst other things, to be about trust for me, because one part of what I think you're pointing out on the right is people feeling community and belonging, and then collective empowerment in the, when you are part of something and you act together, you can actually achieve something, even if it's just a sense that you have some agency, which is much harder to feel alone. But what I was actually asking, that's all commentary now, I was wondering is what significant interrelations you see between the algorithmic and this emotional distinction that you're pointing at, or distinction in satisfaction or fulfillment or belonging between left-wing spaces or groups and right-wing spaces or groups. Yeah, for anyone else to pick up as well.
I'll give it to Jesse.
Oh my God. Can you actually restate the question again?
Well, it may not be very well formulated because it may not be very clear, but I'm wondering about what Chantelle pointed, and you guys as well, to the algorithmic and the society of control was one of the features of the world, what's wrong and what we're up against.
Right.
And also pointed less, well, I captured it less specifically, to people on the right feeling like they can find or are finding or have found or continue to find emotional kinds of satisfaction that people on the left don't. And we're generalizing here. And I'm wondering if there's how those two things are related to each other, if we see any ways in which they're related to each other at all. Maybe maybe it's just to think some more about why there is that distinction between left and right. I mean, some reasons of, yeah, anyway, I'm going on too long now, but why there is that distinction that Chantelle was pointing at. And then secondly, if that has anything to do with, we can find any connections with algorithm and control in explaining that.
Boy, that's a good question. I don't know. In a lot of ways, we've converted care into a burden, and so being given permission not to care feels like the lifting of a weight, right? I don't have to worry about the other guy. I can just focus on myself. There's a real narcissistic element to it. But I'm not sure if I'm answering your question very well.
That's fine. I'm just adding a question to the discussion then, which is on my mind.
I think this is a very important question. I mean, Wendy Chun has a new book on this, in which she argues that the relational dynamic of, let's say, the last 50 years has been a shift towards association. And she compares it to housing policy and racist, enclave-driven social policy. And I think this is an alternative to the more mainstream discourse of filter bubbles, which has a sort of mainstream pull of just saying, oh, everyone just needs to sort of get to the table. The problem is we've been sort of separated. And so we just one big, return to the public square. Right. I think the anarchist twist on this might be that the problem isn't necessarily polarization. It's that a lot of the tech companies who are designing the algorithms that we use, because there's now sort of walled garden approach. It's not just some open internet where you find someone's strange website. That they invest an incredible amount of money in user experience and user interface design, because they're trying to design a very particular way for a user to interact with their platforms. And for that, it's about generating ad revenue. It's about driving clicks. And the things that drive clicks are things like fear-based politics or certain types of like in-group behavior. And that I think that they really don't create, or they have no interest in the long circuits that Chantelle finds so important in Stiegler. And so we might have to ask ourselves, like, what would be a digital long circuit, if there could be one, or how do we create our own alternatives through our own long circuits? And I think that that's really what I think is important, like Chantelle mentioned about info shops. I'm doing a reading group now as sort of like let's say a group therapy to responding to COVID now that we can see each other again. It's about just like finding people.
Right.
We're reading the Graeber book right now. I don't know if that's the best way to find people. Everyone wants to read it, but you get through a couple of weeks worth and you're like, wow, we only have 500 pages left, right?
Finding some staunch people, right?
I actually want to pick up here also on something that you just said, Jesse, which is the narcissism, but because there's also that like individualizing aspect, right? The individual, the moment. And I think it also has to do with the overexposure to algorithms even, right? This overexposure lends itself to a narcissism, to cultivating this kind of narcissistic psyche that is pervading society. And so I think actually, this kind of reactive politics also feeds right into that, because it is a kind of narcissistic politics. As you've said also, Jesse, we don't have to care. It lifts that burden of not caring. And so I think that and that's a kind of nihilism, isn't it? Driving that. Like we're actually we are a social species. And so to not behave in a way that looks after society means that something is very wrong there. Something has gone wrong. And so that narcissistic tendency for me is I really do think it is linked to this kind of overexposure. I mean, even if you think about sort of these child stars years ago, before digitality, and what that did to them. I mean, there's been a lot written on the kind of psychology around that. But this is happening to all of us, or to a large amount of people, at a tremendous rate. And so I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, you had me thinking also about another kind of connection between the algorithmic and the sort of death of care or lack of care. You talk about this society of control or hyper control as one that's always trying to eliminate financial risks, right? Which is all about sort of shirking or shucking off the duty of care. So an example you give is of the use of big data by insurers to avoid taking on the risk, for instance, of insuring a woman who's been the victim of domestic violence. The person who would prematurely die from domestic violence will be considered as almost already dead. This person is therefore removed from insurance, right? This absolute Kafkaesque logic. But the end result is that we're released from the burden to care.
Yeah, so I think that idea of like, minimizing risk, but so a different way to say it is minimizing risk at the expense of really the human being in there. And of course, this actually brings me again, to something that I think is important, again, I think it links to many of the ideas that we've spoken about, but is also the idea that it's not just about us, it's not just about human beings. It's about our interconnectedness with everything on this planet. And so I think that there's, that's another thing that happens when we're online. There's that disconnect, immediate disconnect from nature, for example. And so even caring again about, I think even things like gardening or just walking in nature, becoming aware again of things outside of ourselves that we're so connected to and so dependent on. But we don't really think about it so much anymore. I think some people do. Some people are very concerned with this, but I think a large part of society is not. It's it's this kind of it's this very human experience, and I think that's also really important for me if we're going to deal with this crisis or these crises that we face, is to come back to the kind of interconnectedness, the fact that we're humans, yes, but we're part of everything else, all these other species so closely interconnected. Yeah.
See that John and
yeah.
has noted a few more comments, and I think it's quite important because I think a lot of these algorithms that become financed and popular are based in a labor restructuring. So they find a way to proletarianize and restructure the labor behind various social spheres. You know, we can imagine taxis giving way to Uber as a way of also desocializing it, or preventing the cooperation and socialization that people would have if they worked on an assembly line together. And that, you know, you look out for them, you know, they save you from losing a finger, and they look after your kids, and there's just this natural proximity that works. And so much of apps are to black box, to separate, to in the sake of convenience and efficiency, to reduce the amount of interactions that people have that aren't just sort of like short and fleeting. To me, I think that what I like about DNG is in a sort of non-dialectical way, they're always looking for the sort of, let's say, dialectical upside of all these like transformations and deterritorializations and challenges. So those are things that I like as well, which probably puts me on the more sort of insurrectionary side of anarchism than probably most of the people here. But, you know, I'm playing nice today, so we don't have to bring all those up.
We don't have to talk about smashing the actual state.
Yeah. But I think that's one of the deep enduring questions that we have too, how to turn what looks like a disadvantage or all of these challenges, these social transformations, also to at least a temporary advantage, how to be a bit opportunistic about them. And I think it's difficult because things seem so bleak.
Any final word from you, Jesse?
I've really enjoyed this, and you've given me a lot more to think about. I think particularly some of these new theoretical tools, I want to see how they can be deployed into different kinds of contexts.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you to Andrew and Jesse. I also had a great time here. I'm actually a little bit tired. I've had 3 days of this, so this is the third event. I feel like my words are getting slower and slower. But it was really great having this conversation. It's also given me more to think about. I feel that I want to go write down some notes now before I forget. But yeah, thank you for your graciousness. And just for also the lovely blurbs that you wrote for my book. I really appreciate that.
You made the job very easy for us.
Yeah, and thanks for the kind words about my work.
Yeah, okay, well, thanks for being here, everyone, and hopefully we can do this again sometime, maybe about somebody else's book. That would be great. Okay.
All right.
Stay well.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.